Everyone knows South Park makes fun of everybody. Chinese accents, Japanese cartoons, all of it played for cheap laughs across 20 years of television. Then the show quietly admitted something about one of those jokes that almost nobody caught at the time. And that is exactly why, in this video, we go through every one of them. The toy craze. Chin Pokemon. In the fall of 1999, a small cartoon on Comedy Central pointed itself at the biggest thing happening in American childhood. Pokemon had arrived from Japan 2 years earlier and had gone from a handheld game to a trading card economy that schools were banning. Kids were trading in hallways. Parents were driving to 3 stores in one afternoon. And a show about 4 foul-mouthed boys in Colorado decided the fad was worth an entire episode, built around a fake Japanese cartoon with a name that would have gotten it pulled from any network with a legal department. The episode was called Chin Pokemon, and it aired on November 3rd, 1999, as the 11th episode of the 3rd season and the 42nd episode of the series overall. Trey Parker wrote it and co-directed it with animation director Eric Stuff. The following year, it picked up an Emmy nomination, which is a strange fate for an episode whose title is a compound word built out of the Pokemon name and a Japanese slang term for a small part of the male anatomy. The joke is right there in the title, and most of the American audience watching in 1999 had no idea it was there at all. South Park was 3 seasons old at that point and had already built a specific reputation. The show had gone after Jesus, cancer charities, environmental activists, Jewish summer camp, and its own network. What it did well, better than almost anything else on television at the time, was take a real thing happening in American life and follow it all the way down to the worst possible ending. The formula worked because the writers were paying attention to the actual fad, not a vague idea of it. The cards, the collecting, the way the newest toy made last month's toy worthless, the way a kid could fall behind in a single week, all of that was in the episode, and all of it was accurate. The fad it was aimed at had a specific shape and a specific timeline. Pokemon reached American stores in September of 1998, first as a pair of handheld games, then as a cartoon, then as a trading card line that turned into something closer to a currency. By 1999, the cards had been banned from classrooms across the country because of the fights, the theft, and the gambling that broke out between children over pieces of printed cardboard. Parents were driving between stores. Schools were writing policies. Local news ran segments about the value of individual cards the way they would run segments about a stock. Sitting behind all of that was a real incident that makes the subliminal message plot look far less invented than it does at first. In December of 1997, an episode of the Pokemon cartoon aired in Japan containing a long sequence of rapidly flashing red and blue light. Hundreds of Japanese children were taken to hospital afterward with seizures, headaches, and vomiting. The episode was pulled, the series went on a break, and the story traveled around the world as a piece of trivia about a cartoon that could physically hurt the people watching it. Anybody sitting down in 1999 to write a comedy about Japanese children's media had that story on the desk in front of them. Then there was the year itself. Columbine happened in Colorado in April of 1999, in the same state the show is set in, and the same state both of its creators grew up in, and the months that followed filled up with hearings, studies, and primetime debates about whether entertainment was making children violent. Cartoons, video games, and music all went on trial in front of adults who had mostly never consumed any of them. An episode about parents panicking over the hidden content of a children's cartoon arrived 7 months into that argument, made by 2 men whose own show kept getting named as an example of the problem. The story starts with Cartman watching the Chin Pokemon cartoon and immediately needing the toys. He gets to the store and finds everyone else already there, picking the shelves clean. Kyle shows up at the bus stop holding the wrong doll, the one that was popular 6 days ago, and gets told he has fallen behind. The chase never ends. Every time a character catches up, the target has already moved. Anyone who watched a schoolyard in 1999 recognized the pattern instantly because it was happening in real time in every classroom in the country. The toy store scenes carry a second joke that gets far less attention than the Japanese material. Watching his shelves empty, the American store owner keeps trying to steer the children toward a domestic product line called Alabama Man, a set of American-made action figures sold with a bowling ball and a wife figure available separately. The demonstrations of how to play with Alabama Man involve him drinking, missing work, and hitting his wife with the bowling ball. The children are not interested in him at all. Those scenes play in live action, shot the way a real toy commercial from that period was shot, with a voiceover and children shouting on cue. A second commercial in the same style advertises something called the Wild Wacky Action Bike, whose only stated selling point, repeated over and over inside a jingle designed to be impossible to forget, is that the bike is difficult to ride. The purpose of all that is to strip any high ground away from the American side of the argument before the Japanese plot arrives. The parents in this episode are frightened of what Japan is selling their children, and the alternative sitting on the the next shelf is a toy about domestic violence and a bicycle that does not work. Neither product is on that shelf because it is good for anyone. Both are there because children will scream until somebody buys one, which is the only mechanism the episode treats as real. Then the episode turns. The Pokemon toys are being made by a Japanese company, and the company has a plan. Hidden inside the cartoon and inside the toys are messages designed to turn American children into soldiers. The video game the kids are playing is a flight simulator. The Japanese executives running the operation are working toward a second strike on the United States, using American children as the weapon, and the whole thing is being funded by American parents handing over their credit cards at the toy store. That is a heavy thing to put in a cartoon about collectible monsters, and the episode knows it. The gag depends entirely on the audience already carrying a specific piece of American memory around with them. Pearl Harbor sits in the American mind as the moment Japan became the enemy, and the episode reaches straight for it. 58 years had passed. Japan had been an American ally for most of that time. The country's main export to American children was a cartoon about a yellow mouse, and South Park built its punchline on the idea that none of that had really changed underneath. The executives themselves are where the episode does most of its stereotype work. They are small, they bow constantly, they smile through every conversation, and they deflect every single question by complimenting whoever is asking. When American adults confront them about the messages hidden in the toys, the executives respond by praising the size of American anatomy. It works every time. The adults get flustered, feel good about themselves, and stop asking. One of the executives even tries the same flattery on Sharon Marsh, which does not go as smoothly and earns him a smack from his colleague. The bowing, the flattery, the relentless politeness masking a plan underneath. That is a specific caricature with a long history in American film and American wartime propaganda, and the episode uses it without softening the edges at all. The executives are never shown as ordinary businessmen who happen to be Japanese. They are shown as a type, and the type is the joke. At the same time, the episode is doing something to the American characters that is far less flattering than what it does to the Japanese ones. Randy and Sharon Marsh sit down to watch the Pokemon cartoon so they can figure out whether it is appropriate for their son. They cannot follow a single second of it. The names mean nothing to them. The story references things they never learned, and they give up within a minute, completely lost. That scene is not making fun of Japan. It is making fun of the parents, and the specific comedy in it comes from watching two adults panic about a piece of media they have not bothered to understand. The ending pushes that idea all the way. The parents cannot stop the fad by banning it, so they try the opposite approach and become fans themselves. They learn the names, they buy the toys, they start playing along. And the moment the parents are into it, every kid in town loses interest instantly, because the entire appeal was that it belonged to them and not to adults. The fad dies the second it becomes uncool, which is exactly how real fads die. Kyle carries the one thread the episode treats with any sympathy. He is the boy who is always holding last week's toy, always one purchase behind, always being informed by somebody that the thing he just bought is worthless now. At one point, he decides he is finished with the whole business and announces that he does not need to follow the crowd, which lasts about as long as it takes for him to be standing alone. The relief of stepping outside a fad and the loneliness of stepping outside a fad turn out to be the same feeling, and the episode declines to resolve that in his favor. By the end, he is back in, because everybody is back in, and then the fad dies for reasons that have nothing to do with anything he decided. So the episode is running two engines at once. One engine is aimed at American consumer panic, at parents who buy whatever their kids scream for and then hold hearings about it afterward, at a country that treats every new craze as a national emergency until the next one shows up. That engine is sharp and it holds up well. The other engine is aimed at Japan, and it runs on wartime imagery, exaggerated politeness, and a language joke buried in the title that most viewers never noticed. Both engines were running at the same time in front of the same audience, and the audience mostly heard one of them. The episode became known as the Pokemon one. The bit people repeated afterward was the flattery gag, delivered in an accent, quoted back and forth in school hallways by kids who had no interest in the satire around it. That gap between what an episode is doing and what an audience takes away from it is something that would follow this show for the next 2 decades. There is also the matter of the language. Beyond the title, the episode is full of actual Japanese, used correctly. In one classroom scene, the children mock their teacher in Japanese while he stands there with no idea what is being said. That is not gibberish written to sound foreign. It is real Japanese, written by someone who could speak it, and the joke only works for the small slice of the audience who could follow along. A show that is careless about a culture does not usually bother with that kind of detail. A show that is careful about a culture does not usually build its punchline on a second attack on Pearl Harbor. Pokemon does both things in 22 minutes. The show's account of what the Pokemon cartoon is doing to its audience is worth stating plainly, because it is the part that reads least like a joke now. The cartoon inside the episode carries advertising advertising for its own merchandise woven directly into the story, along with messages aimed at the children watching that sit below the level of anything they would consciously notice. In 1999, that was written as an absurd exaggeration of Japanese marketing. It describes a fairly ordinary children's media business 25 years later, and nobody running one of those businesses has needed to hide anything inside a cartoon to make it work. The Emmy nomination in 2000 says something about how the episode landed at the time. This was the awards establishment putting its stamp on a cartoon whose title is an anatomical pun in a foreign language, and whose plot ends with brainwashed American children flying toy planes at a naval base. Nobody involved was hiding what the episode contained. It aired, it was nominated, and the conversation moved on. The show also worked out something here about how a fad ends, and it has held up better than most predictions made in 1999. Bans do not kill a craze. Outrage does not kill a craze. Congressional attention keeps it alive by advertising it. The only thing that reliably kills it is adults joining in, because the entire value of the object was that it belonged to children and did not belong to anyone else. The parents in this episode stumble onto that by accident after everything else fails, and every fad since has died the same way. What Chin Pokemon set in place was a template the show would use for the next 20 years. Take something real coming out of Asia into American life. Point most of the comedy at how ridiculously Americans react to it. Keep the caricature in the frame anyway, because the caricature is where the biggest laugh lives. Every episode covered from this point forward is running some version of that same setup, adjusted for whatever year it is and whatever the country happened to be nervous about at the time. The show had gone after Japan from a distance through a fake cartoon and a fake toy company, with no Japanese character living in the town at all. Everything in the episode happened somewhere else and arrived in Colorado through a television screen. That would not stay true for long. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 years later, a new restaurant opened on the main street of South Park. The man behind the counter would outlast almost every other side character. His accent became one of the most quoted things South Park ever made, and the truth about him stayed buried for 9 seasons. Section 2. The Restaurant Owner. City Wok and Tuong Lu Kim. By 2002, the show had already spent 5 seasons establishing that no group in the town was safe, and the ethnic material had mostly arrived in short bursts. What had not happened yet was a recurring adult built entirely on one, sitting in the background of the town week after week, rather than appearing once and leaving. He shows up in season 6, in an episode called Jared Has AIDS, and the joke arrives before the character does. His restaurant is called City Wok, and when he says the name of his own business out loud, the way he pronounces the first word turns it into something the network would normally bleep. That single sound is the entire reason the character exists. Everything else about Tuong Lu Kim was built afterward, around a pun that lasted 1 second. Trey Parker voices him, using a broad accent that the show never once treats as anything other than funny. The design is simple: a mustache, a chef's outfit, a permanent look of irritation. In a town where almost every resident is white, he is the only Chinese person anybody ever sees, which turns him into a stand-in for an entire country of more than 1 billion people whenever the plot needs one. The 2002 debut is small. The boys prank call him, then try to talk him into using Butters as a spokesman for the restaurant, the way a real sandwich chain had built an entire ad campaign around a customer who lost weight. It falls apart, he refuses to go along with it, and at the end he offers the boys $15, pronounced in a way that turns the money into another accent gag. That is the whole appearance. A pun, a business, and a walk-off. 9 episodes later, the show handed him something much bigger. Child Abduction Is Not Funny aired on July 24, 2002, as the 11th episode of season 6 and the 90th episode overall. The plot starts with the parents of South Park watching news coverage of kidnappings and losing their minds about it. Real America was in the middle of the same panic that summer, with wall-to-wall coverage of missing children driving parents into a state that had very little to do with the actual numbers. The town responds the way South Park towns always respond, which is to say completely out of proportion. They strap tracking helmets onto their kids, they hold an emergency meeting, and then they land on their real solution, which is to build a wall around the entire town. The panic in that episode was not invented for television. The summer of 2002 produced a run of child abduction cases that took over American news coverage for months, and the coverage got heavy enough that the period picked up a name of its own afterward. Cable news ran the story almost continuously. Parents bought tracking devices. Legislators announced new alert systems. The actual number of stranger abductions in the United States had not moved in any meaningful way, and the gap between the coverage and the numbers is the thing this episode is built on top of. South Park put that gap on screen without softening any part of it. The parents fit their children with enormous tracking helmets that make it difficult to see or move. They hold an emergency meeting where nobody proposes anything sensible. Every new piece of information they receive perceive makes them behave worse rather than better, and each escalation gets presented as an obvious next step by people who believe they are being responsible. The episode aired on July 24, 2002. In the middle of the coverage it was making fun of, which is an aggressive thing to broadcast while the country was still watching the story every night. The moment they decide on the wall, they know exactly who to call. They call the man who runs the Chinese restaurant because he is Chinese, and the Great Wall of China is Chinese, so obviously he can build one. That is the joke, and the episode makes sure nobody misses it. Lu Kim is openly insulted by the request. He points out that the assumption behind it is ridiculous. He has no construction experience. He runs a restaurant. The idea that his ancestry qualifies him to personally build a fortification around a Colorado town is offensive on its face, and he says so. Randy Marsh gives him a speech anyway, one of those overblown emotional appeals the show loves to hand him, and Lu Kim gives in and starts laying bricks. Then, alone, working through the night on a wall he never wanted to build, he gets attacked by Mongolians. Nobody explains the Mongolians. They arrive out of nowhere, they knock sections of the wall down, they retreat, and they come back. Lu Kim spends the rest of the episode shouting about them, rebuilding what they broke, and getting angrier every time. The bit runs on a piece of history most of the audience knew in only the vaguest sense, which is that the original Great Wall was built partly to keep out invaders from the north. South Park took that fact, dropped it into modern Colorado with no explanation at all, and let it play completely straight. The Mongolians are treated as an ongoing fact of life, like weather. The ending puts a bow on the town's part of it. A study comes out showing that the overwhelming majority of child abductions are committed by a parent, so the adults of South Park reverse course entirely and throw their children out of the house to keep them safe from themselves. The wall becomes pointless. The mayor turns to Lu Kim and asks him to tear it down, borrowing a famous line from a Cold War speech about the Berlin Wall, and he takes that about as well as anyone would. Two different jokes are running in that episode, and they aim in opposite directions. The first one is aimed squarely at the town. A group of white parents in a panic decides that the local Chinese restaurant owner can build a mile of stone wall because of where his grandparents were born. That is a joke about how white Americans think about Asian people, and the character on the receiving end is the only one in the episode behaving reasonably. He objects. He is correct to object. The audience is meant to be laughing at the people making the request. The second joke is aimed at him. His accent is a constant punchline, present in every line he delivers. His rage at the Mongolians is played as an ancient ethnic grudge he cannot let go of, and the show gets a laugh out of a Chinese character being just as prejudiced as the townspeople who insulted him. He is written as somebody who cannot separate his personal business from a 1,000-year-old conflict. There is a smaller detail in the wall plot that carries more than it looks like. Lu Kim builds the thing alone. No crew arrives, no contractor is hired, and nobody in town offers to help him lay a single brick. The parents commission a mile of stonework from one man, walk away, and then complain about the pace. The town's assumption is not only that he can build a great wall because he is Chinese, it is that he can build it by himself, at night, for a group of people who will not thank him for it. Those two jokes sitting inside one episode is the whole argument about this character in miniature, and it never really got settled. The defense has always been that the town is the target and Lu Kim is the straight man. The criticism has always been simpler, which is that the accent is doing the heavy lifting. Take away the pronunciation and the character stops being funny. Whatever the writers were aiming at, the sound of a white man performing a Chinese accent is what carried the laugh out of the television and into the world, and it carried a long way. City Walk became one of the most repeated things South Park ever produced. Kids who had never seen the Wall episode could do the voice. The restaurant's name got shouted across cafeterias by people who had no idea there was any satire attached to it. The pronunciation gag detached itself from the show completely and became its own thing, which is close to the worst possible outcome for a joke that was supposedly about somebody else's ignorance. There is a long American tradition sitting behind that voice, and it did not begin in Colorado in 2002. The specific sound being performed, with English words reshaped around a set of substitutions that no actual Chinese speaker consistently produces, was standardized by American vaudeville and then carried into film for most of the 20th century, usually attached to a laundryman, a cook, or a servant. It was never an attempt at accuracy. It was a costume, built to be recognized instantly from a distance, and it worked, because audiences had been trained for decades to recognize it. What that history means for the City Walk material is that the joke did not have to be constructed. The sound already existed, fully loaded, and the writers only had to reach for it. That is exactly why it travels so easily, and why the satire around it falls away so fast in transit. A joke built from scratch has to be understood before it can be repeated. A joke that plugs into something the audience already carried into the room can be repeated by anybody who heard it once, and understanding is optional. The show kept using him, and kept expanding what he was. In Crazy Cripples, Jimmy and Timmy roll into City Walk and Lu Kim mistakes them for gang members, which lets the episode run a joke about how he sees his own customers. In It's Christmas in Canada, the boys need to get to Canada and discover that Lou Kim also operates an airline out of the same building, which requires nothing more than flipping a sign and putting on a pilot's cap. City Airlines has exactly one plane, a small yellow Cessna, and it does not survive the episode. He shows up singing in a crowd scene at the end of I'm a Little Bit Country. He becomes furniture. He becomes part of the town. The business expansions follow their own logic. Every time a plot needs a service the town does not have, Lou Kim already provides it, because the underlying joke is that a Chinese restaurant owner in a small American town is assumed to be running several operations out of one building. The airline is the clearest version of it. There is no aircraft worth the name, no visible licensing, and no staff beyond the man already standing at the counter, and the town accepts the arrangement without a single question. He carried over into the games as well, which is where a side character stops being a running gag and becomes an institution. In the first South Park role-playing game, he turns up building yet another wall around the town and helps the player by pouring hot sauce on enemies. In the sequel, he appears as a merchant who hands out a quest, and the quest is clearing Mongolians out of his restaurant and out of a nearby tower. Two full games, made years apart, both treated a decade-old joke about a man who cannot keep a wall standing as part of the town's basic geography. Season 6 is also a strange place for a character this durable to arrive. Kenny had been killed off at the end of the previous season and was absent for most of the year, which left the show without one of its 4 leads and experimenting with replacements. This episode is the last one to use Tweak as the 4th boy in the group. The following episode started bringing Kenny back through Cartman, and he was fully restored by the season finale. The Wall episode sits at the exact point where the show was least sure of its own cast, and the thing it produced that lasted longest from that stretch is The Man with the Restaurant. Audiences agreed at the time and kept agreeing. More than a decade later, a fan vote to pick the strongest episode of season 6 landed on this one, ahead of episodes that get discussed far more often. That is the thing worth sitting with about this character. Most South Park side characters built on a single gag burnout inside a season. Lou Kim did not. He kept getting written into episodes for over a decade, kept getting new businesses and new grievances, and became one of the few recurring adults in the show who could carry a subplot on his own. The accent got him in the door, and then the writers found more for him to do than the accent. By the middle of the show's run, the character had become awkward to defend. The culture around him had shifted. White performers voicing Asian characters had gone from unremarkable to a live argument, and South Park had one of the most visible examples on television, still running, still in the opening credits crowd shots, still doing the voice. Other shows in the same position eventually recast, apologized, or quietly retired the character. South Park did none of those things. The writers went a completely different direction with it, and when they finally did, they blew up 9 seasons of their own work in a single episode. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years later, the boys walked into a county fair and walked out with a bag of real weapons. What happened next changed the way the show looked, sounded, and moved. And it came from the one part of Asian culture Trey Parker seemed to actually love. Section 3, the anime episode, Good Times with Weapons, Season 8 opens on March 17, 2004, with the boys at the Park County Fair standing in front of a stall selling what the vendor advertises as authentic weapons from the Far East. Real blades, real throwing stars. Stan wants the tonfas, Cartman wants the sassies, Kyle wants the nunchucks, and Kenny is drawn to a shuriken. The vendor tells them he cannot sell to children without a parent present, so they tell him their parents died in a car crash the year before, and he hands the weapons over. The episode is called Good Times with Weapons. It is the 112th episode of the series, written and directed by Trey Parker. It is also the episode where South Park stopped looking like South Park. The boys walk out of the fair with their new gear and start playing ninjas in a vacant lot, the way children have always played, and the animation changes. The construction paper cutouts drop away. In their place are 4 figures drawn in a completely different style, sharp and detailed and shaded, with flowing hair and dramatic poses, and glowing energy around their hands. Stan becomes a masked swordsman. Kyle becomes a fighter with the power of fire. Cartman becomes a character who claims to have the power of invisibility. Kenny becomes something fast and silent. They look like they walked out of an arcade fighting game or a Saturday afternoon action series, and for the length of every fantasy sequence, the show simply becomes that thing. The transformations are not treated as a costume change. Each boy gets a name, a weapon, and a power, and the episode holds to those rules with the seriousness of a genre it respects. Cartman claims the power of invisibility, which nobody else accepts, and the entire argument about whether his power is legitimate takes place inside the fantasy rather than outside it. Chef appears in there too, redrawn in the same style, warning them about what they are carrying. The show is not interrupting the anime to make fun of it. It stays inside it and lets the comedy come from 4 children applying its rules to a Colorado parking lot. lot. Over the top of it plays a song called Let's Fighting Love, written and performed by Trey Parker. It is built as a copy of the theme songs that open Japanese action cartoons, complete with the driving beat and the shouted chorus. The lyrics mix Japanese and English with no regard for grammar, tense, or sense, jumping between languages mid-line the way real anime themes often do when they reach for English words. It is a parody of a very specific thing, which is the way English shows up inside Japanese pop music as decoration rather than meaning. The song became one of the most popular pieces of music the show ever produced, and outlived the episode it came from by years. Underneath all of that, the actual plot is grim. During one of the fantasy fights, Kenny throws his shuriken, and it lands in Butters' eye. The animation snaps back to cutouts instantly. Butters is on the ground with a blade in his face, and 4 10-year-olds are standing over him, realizing they are in serious trouble. Butters takes the worst of it, which by this point in the series had become his role. He spends the episode with a blade in his face, gets disguised as a dog, is dumped at an animal shelter, is urinated on, escapes, and then walks across town to find the 4 children responsible. The show is generous with him at the very end, and his parents do get him to a hospital, but the route there runs through most of the episode. What follows is the boys trying to get Butters medical help without any adult finding out what they did. They shave Stan's dog and glue the fur to Butters so they can pass him off as an animal and drop him at a shelter. He gets urinated on. He escapes. Cartman, still convinced his ninja power is invisibility, decides the safe way to move Butters through town is to take all his clothes off and walk down the middle of the street. That is where the episode lands its actual point. The town is at a community talent show. Butters staggers in with a throwing star sticking out of his eye, and not one adult reacts to it because Cartman is standing next to him with no clothes on. The entire crowd loses its mind about the nudity. A child with a blade in his skull is standing in plain sight, and nobody looks at him. The boys are let off completely, keep their weapons, and the episode closes on a freeze frame of the 3 of them holding an anime pose. The timing of that ending was not general. 6 weeks before this episode aired, the Super Bowl halftime show ended with roughly half a second of exposed flesh on live television, and the American broadcasting industry lost its mind for the rest of the year. The regulator was buried in complaints. Fines went up. Networks started running tape delays on live events. Radio stations dropped programming. An entire regulatory posture shifted because of an incident measured in fractions of a second during a broadcast that had been selling erectile dysfunction medication all afternoon. Nothing comparable happened about violence, and nothing ever does. That imbalance is what the ending of this episode was built to expose, and the audience watching in March of 2004 needed no explanation of it because they had spent 6 weeks living inside the exact argument the final scene stages. None of that is a joke about Japanese people. The target is American adults and what they choose to be upset about, which was an especially loaded subject in March of 2004, 6 weeks after a Super Bowl halftime show had turned a 2-second wardrobe incident into a national scandal, while nobody said much of anything about violence on television. The episode is built as a direct response to that, and the ninja material is the delivery system rather than the point, which makes this episode the odd one out. Everything else covered in this video involves South Park pointing at something Asian and finding the joke in it. Good Times with Weapons does something closer to the opposite. It borrows a Japanese visual language, uses it carefully and at length, and treats it as something worth doing well. The care shows in the details. The song is not nonsense syllables, designed to sound vaguely foreign, which would have been the easy version, and the version most American comedies of that era would have written. The Japanese in it is real Japanese, performed by somebody who could actually speak it, and the humor for anyone who understands the language runs in a completely different direction than the humor for anyone who does not. The English-speaking audience hears a pounding anime theme song and laughs at the mismatch with what is happening on screen. The Japanese-speaking audience hears a singer bragging about his anatomy, and then, in the second verse, commenting on how ridiculous the lyrics he is singing are. That kind of double layer takes work. It is the same instinct that put real Japanese into the Chin Pokemon classroom scene 5 years earlier, and it points at something specific about how this particular show approached this particular country. There is a difference between mocking a people and mocking a style, and this episode sits firmly on the second side of that line. The animation carries the same weight. The transformed versions of the boys are not sloppy imitations. They are built with real attention to how those characters are actually drawn, right down to the poses, the lighting effects, the way the camera swings around a fight, the exaggerated speed lines. Somebody at the studio watched a great deal of this material and reproduced it accurately, which is not something a production does out of contempt. Japan runs underneath this show more consistently than most viewers notice, and the tell is always the same. When South Park makes fun of something it is not bothered with, the details come out approximate. When it makes fun of something it is actually consumed, the details come out exact. The Japanese in this episode is exact. The Japanese in the toy episode 5 years earlier was exact. attack. The timing of the transformations, the way the camera behaves during an attack, the specific rhythm of a fight scene, all of it is reproduced closely enough that the parody works as a functioning example of the thing being parodied. That level of accuracy is a choice somebody made repeatedly across years about one country in particular. That said, the episode is not clean, and pretending otherwise would miss part of what is going on. The core joke of Let's Fighting Love is broken English. The title itself is broken English. The entire comedic premise is that Japanese pop music uses English badly, and the audience is invited to laugh at the mistakes. That is not 100 miles from the accent humor running through the City Walk material. It is dressed up more attractively and executed with more skill, but the underlying laugh is still about Asian people using English wrong, and that laugh has a long and ugly history in American entertainment that predates this show by about a century. There is also the vendor at the fair, selling what he calls authentic weapons from the Far East, using the vague catch-all phrase that flattens an enormous part of the world into a single exotic product category. The show is clearly aware of that. The vendor is a mark. He gets conned by 4 children inside 30 seconds, and the joke is at his expense. But the phrase sits there anyway, doing the same work it does in every strip mall martial arts shop in America. The vendor at the fair deserves a second look, because the transaction he is part of is the actual engine of the plot. He is selling real weapons at a county fair in Colorado, and the exotic packaging is the entire sales pitch. Nothing about the products requires them to come from anywhere in particular. Calling them authentic and attaching a region to them is what converts a box of blades into a purchase, and 4 10-year-olds understand that well enough to exploit it inside 30 seconds. What they exploit is not his greed, it is his sentimentality. He refuses to sell to children, holds the line properly, and then folds completely the moment they invent a pair of dead parents. The one adult in the episode who tries to behave responsibly gets beaten by a story, which sets up everything that follows, including the throwing star and the crowd that cannot see it. Parker and Stone included this episode in the compilation of their own 10 favorites that Comedy Central released in 2006, alongside a set of episodes most people would name as the show's best work. It has stayed a fan favorite for the same reason. It is technically ambitious. It is funny in 2 different registers at once, and the anime sequences hold up as real animation rather than as a gag about animation. A few production details underline how much the studio thought of it. This was the first episode voiced by April Stewart, who took over the bulk of the female characters after the previous performer left, so an episode remembered for its animation was also a quiet reset of the show's cast. 3 years later, when the studio wanted one episode to demonstrate the series in high definition, this is the one they rebuilt and handed out free with hardware purchases. Nobody re-renders a throwaway. It traveled further than most episodes of its era in other ways too. Comedy Central released it as part of a compilation of the 10 episodes Parker and Stone named as their own favorites, sitting alongside work that turns up on best of lists constantly. The song outlived all of it. Let's Fighting Love became a piece of internet culture on its own, covered and remixed and used as opening music by people who had never watched the episode it came from, which puts it in the small category of jokes from this show that escaped into the world without a caricature attached to them. What it shows about the show's relationship with Asia is more complicated than the accent episodes alone would suggest. The same writers who built a character entirely out of a mispronunciation also spent an enormous amount of time and money accurately recreating a foreign animation style because they liked it. Both of those things were true at the same time, in the same building, coming from the same 2 people. The other thing this episode proves is that the show could hold a bit for a long time when it wanted to. The anime sequences are not a 30-second gag. They run repeatedly across the episode with consistent character designs, consistent powers, and a musical theme that returns each time, which meant the studio had to build and animate an entire second visual style for one episode of television in 2004. That is an expensive decision for a joke, and the show made it again in later years whenever a parody was worth doing properly. Neither of those instincts cancels the other out. They just sat side by side for 20 years, and the show never seemed especially interested in explaining the gap. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A year later, a real singer with a real recording career agreed to appear as herself, not an American celebrity doing a favor. A Chinese woman living on the other side of the world, and what the show did with her career says more than any invented character could. Section 4. The Real Singer. Wing Trey Parker and Matt Stone found her on the internet, and their first question was whether she was a real person at all. Wing Han Sang was born in Hong Kong and lived in New Zealand, where she had built a small career singing cover versions of famous songs. Her recordings were unusual enough that they circulated online as a curiosity, passed around by people who could not decide whether they were listening to something sincere or something staged. The 2 men who ran South Park found the recordings, decided she was real, and wrote her into an episode of their show. What she was doing was not a joke she was in on. Wing Wing had trained as a singer, performed for her community, and released albums of covers of songs almost everybody already knew, and she meant every part of it. The recordings circulated online in the early 2000s as part of a wave of found audio that people passed around specifically because the performances struck them as unusual, which is a polite way of describing what was actually happening to her. She had an earnest career and an audience laughing at it, and the two had very little contact with each other until an American cartoon put them in the same room. That is the situation Parker and Stone walked into, and it explains their first reaction. The question was never whether the recordings were funny to them. The question was whether there was a real person at the end of them, because the internet of that period was full of material that turned out to be somebody performing a character. Wing was not performing a character. She agreed, she recorded her part, and the show had to write and send a formal request for permission to use her music, which is a considerably more careful process than the episode around it would suggest. The episode is called Wing. It aired on March 23, 2005, as the third episode of season 9 and the 128th episode of the series. Wing appeared as herself, voicing her own character and singing 3 songs, 2 of them ABBA covers and 1 from the Carpenters. Parker and Stone had to write and send a letter requesting permission to use her music. She recorded her part remotely, never set foot in the studio, and became a permanent part of the South Park universe anyway. The story around her is standard South Park mechanics. Tolkien wins a singing contest that will pay him $200 to perform at a beauty pageant, and the other boys immediately decide to become his agents so they can take a percentage of it. They form the Super Awesome Talent Agency. Tolkien gets poached by a real agency almost instantly, leaving the boys with no clients, so they go looking for new talent and end up at City Walk. That is where the episode ties itself to everything that came before. Wing is written as the wife of Tuong Lu Kim. Until this point, Lu Kim had been a man with a restaurant, an airline, and a grudge against Mongolians. Now he has a marriage, a debt, and a wife with a career, which turns a walking pronunciation joke into somebody with an actual life happening around him. The boy at the center of the opening is worth naming carefully, because the show changed its own answer later. For most of the series, he was known to the audience as Token, the only black child in the 4th grade, a name that was itself a joke about tokenism. In a much later season, the show revealed that his name had always been Tolkien, and that everybody, including the other characters, had simply been mishearing it for 2 decades. Whichever version a viewer prefers, his role in this episode does not change. He is the one person in the story with a marketable ability, and he is the one person who finishes the episode worse off than he started. The debt is where the trouble starts. Wing was smuggled into the United States by the Chinese mafia, and Lu Kim owes them $10,000 for the service. He has not paid. The mafia comes to collect, threatens him inside his own restaurant by dumping his food trays across the counter until he talks, and eventually takes Wing by force. The boys, who understand almost nothing about what is happening, assume the men in the limousine are just a rival talent agency who poach their client the same way Tolkien was poached. That confusion runs the rest of the episode. They track the mafia to a warehouse and walk into a shootout that kills Kenny and a large number of gangsters, staged as a direct copy of the ending of Scarface, with Cartman delivering the famous line from that film. Earlier in the episode, they get Wing into an audition line for a national singing competition, a line so long that one man in it mentions he has been waiting for more than 2 weeks. The audition sequence is where the episode lands its clearest joke about the industry it is describing. The line to be seen by a national singing competition stretches the length of an entire film studio lot, thousands of people deep, and one man standing in it mentions that he has been waiting there for more than 2 weeks. Nobody in that line is being deceived exactly. Everybody understands the odds. They are queuing anyway, because the alternative is accepting that the thing they want is not going to happen, and an entire industry has been built inside the gap between those two positions. Sylvester Stallone turns up in the same stretch, drawn and voiced as a man whose speech has degraded to the point that he needs an interpreter standing beside him to translate it into English. He is also the one with all the power in the story. He books the act, sets the fee, and decides the outcome, and not one person in the room can understand a word he says. That is the show's picture of who ends up in charge of other people's careers. The Chinese mafia in this episode is a stack of familiar images: organized crime, human smuggling, threats delivered in accented English, a boss who talks about owning a person. All of it arrives with no explanation, the same way the Mongolians did 3 years earlier, because the show assumes the audience already has the picture in their head and only needs it switched on. What the episode does with that picture is the interesting part. The mafia and the talent agency end up being the same thing. The boys spend the episode treating a human being as a revenue stream, taking a cut of her voice, moving her around the country to wherever she can generate money for them. The gangsters do the identical thing with more paperwork and more guns. At the end, the boys realize their business is built on using people, and the mafia boss reaches exactly the same conclusion about his own operation, and both organizations shut down in the same conversation. That equivalent violence is the actual argument of the episode. American talent management and human trafficking get placed side by side, and the show declines to draw much of a line between them. It is a serious point being made through a shootout in a cartoon, and it works because the audience has spent 20 minutes watching four 10-year-olds negotiate percentages over a woman who never gets asked what she wants. The resolution arrives through one of the least believable conversations the show ever wrote, and the writing knows it. Stan delivers a speech about not treating talented people as property, and it lands at the same moment on two audiences who should not both be persuaded by it. The boys shut down their agency. The mafia leader, in the same beat, gives up human trafficking. Neither party ever works out that they have been having completely different conversations, and the show never lets them work it out, because the joke only functions for as long as both sides believe they are in the same business. That is also the episode stating its position without announcing it. The distance between a talent agency and a smuggling operation is supposed to be enormous. This episode compresses it down to nothing and then declines to defend the compression, which leaves the audience holding it on the way out. The closing sequence goes to a wedding, staged as a copy of the opening of The Godfather, with characters from earlier episodes filling out the guest list. Wing performs. Everybody listens. Tolkien, who had the real career opportunity at the start of the episode, is discovered working as a waiter at the same event, trying to earn enough money to get home, because the big agency that stole him never actually did anything for him. The homages are unusually dense for 22 minutes. The wedding is staged from the opening of The Godfather, with a guest list padded out by celebrities the show had used in earlier years. The warehouse shootout is lifted from the ending of Scarface, down to Cartman borrowing the line that film gets quoted for most. Kenny dies in the middle of it, which by that stage of the run had become rare enough to register on its own. Even the pageant performance carries a borrowed shape, using an original Lou Rawls recording rather than an imitation, with Rawls credited for the vocal. Stacking that many references into one episode does something beyond showing off. Every film being referenced is about organized crime, ambition, or somebody being consumed by an industry, which keeps pointing the story back at its own argument, while the plot pretends to be about 4 children and a percentage. Then the episode ends on something no other South Park episode had done. A real photograph of the real Wing appears on screen, along with a promotion for her actual website. It also sits oddly against how the show usually handles guests. Celebrities who appear in South Park are normally there to be humiliated, and most of them are impersonated rather than involved. Wing is one of a small number of real people who came in, played themselves, and left with the show pointing at their work approvingly. Whatever the episode is doing to her voice for 22 minutes, the last thing it does is tell several million Americans where to find her records. That final image complicates everything in front of it. For 22 minutes, the show has run jokes about a Chinese woman with a heavy accent, smuggled into the country in the back of a criminal enterprise, married to the town's ethnic punchline. Then the credits essentially turn into an advertisement for her career. Reports afterward indicated her record sales went up following the episode, which makes South Park one of the few shows to build an episode around laughing at a working musician and simultaneously hand her the biggest audience she had ever had. The answer probably depends on something the episode cannot settle, which is whether her performances were meant to be laughed at in the first place. She sings 3 well-known songs across the episode, arranged straight, delivered sincerely, and the show never adds a single sound effect or reaction shot to tell the audience how to hear them. The characters listen, the crowd at the wedding enjoys it, the comedy in every scene around her comes from the people negotiating over her rather than from her voice. Whether that counts as generous or as something less flattering depends entirely on how the singing was meant to land. If the joke is that her voice is funny, then the show found a real woman on the other side of the planet, put her voice in front of millions of Americans as a punchline, and sent her a check. If the joke is that the American entertainment machine cannot tell the difference between talent and product, then she is the one person in the episode with any dignity left at the end, and everybody around her is the target. The website plug at the end is the detail that has aged into something strange. Television comedies do not usually close an episode by directing their audience to go and buy a real person's records, and there is no obvious version of this where the show gains anything by doing it. Reporting afterward indicated her sales went up. Whatever else those 22 minutes did to her, they also handed a working musician in New Zealand the largest audience of her life, on purpose, in the final 10 seconds. The episode itself never picks. Both readings survive the credits. Wing kept appearing afterward. She turns up as a vendor in a later episode, gets mentioned by her husband as the only remaining customer at his failing restaurant, and continues showing up in the background of the town years later. Like Lou Kim, she stopped being a one-off gag and became part of the furniture. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 years later, a stadium in Beijing, filled up with more than 15,000 performers, moving in perfect formation, broadcast live into American living rooms. One 10-year-old in Colorado Colorado watched the whole thing and reached a conclusion that put him inside a suburban restaurant with a hostage situation and a firearm. Section 5. The Olympics Panic. The China Program. The title is the joke. Before a single frame plays, the episode has already made its move, swapping one letter in the word problem so that the title itself is written in the accent. That is the level the episode operates at, and it does not pretend otherwise at any point in the next 22 minutes. The China Program aired on October 8, 2008, as the 8th episode of Season 12 and the 175th episode of the series. Trey Parker wrote and directed it. It was the mid-season return for that year, the first episode the studio produced in widescreen, and it carried a dedication to Isaac Hayes, the voice of Chef, who had died 2 months earlier. The dedication at the front of the episode marks something the show was still absorbing at the time. Isaac Hayes had voiced Chef for 9 years, left the series in 2006 after a dispute connected to an episode about Scientology, and died in August of 2008. The circumstances of his departure were later disputed by his family. The character had been written out of the show violently before any of that. Putting his name at the top of an episode 2 months after his death was about as direct a gesture as this series has ever made, and it sits at the front of 22 minutes that contain a hostage situation and a sustained joke about a film franchise. It opens with Cartman watching the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. That ceremony was a real event, and a staggering one. Thousands of performers moving in exact unison, a display of coordination and scale that no other country had attempted at that level. Broadcast worldwide in August of 2008. American coverage of it was full of a specific tone that mixed admiration with something closer to alarm, and a lot of the commentary that followed was less about athletics than about what the ceremony was supposed to signal regarding where the world was heading. The specifics are worth having. The ceremony ran on the 8th of August 2008, on a date chosen for a number considered lucky, directed by one of the country's best-known filmmakers. Its opening sequence used more than 2,000 drummers, moving as a single unit. The budget was unlike anything a host country had spent before. Western broadcasters covering it kept reaching for the same word, which was flawless, and kept saying it in a tone that was not entirely admiring. Then the corrections started arriving. The fireworks that appeared to march across the city toward the stadium had been partly generated on a computer for the broadcast feed. The small girl who sang in front of the world was miming, and the voice belonged to a different child who had been judged less suitable to be seen. Both stories broke within days, and both were confirmed by people who had worked on the production. The most watched display of national competence in a generation turned out to have been assembled the way any other broadcast is assembled, and the American conversation about it shifted almost immediately from admiration into something closer to unease about what else was being staged. That is the material Cartman is sitting in front of. The episode never mentions any of it, and does not need to, because the mood it is making fun of was the entire news environment that autumn. Cartman watches it and cannot sleep. He has nightmares. He wakes his mother in the middle of the night, certain that China is coming, that the population and the technology and the discipline all add up to an invasion that nobody else has noticed yet. The next morning at the bus stop, he lays out his plan to the other boys. Nobody engages. Stan turns to Kyle and points out that this is normally the moment where Kyle tells Cartman to stop being racist, and Kyle says he cannot do it anymore and walks away. That exchange is doing something specific and worth pausing on. The show is openly acknowledging its own structure. For 12 seasons, the arrangement had been that Cartman says something appalling and Kyle objects, and the objection is what keeps the joke inside the frame of satire. In this episode, the show removes the objection on purpose and lets the audience watch what the joke looks like without it. Nobody corrects him. Nobody stops him. He proceeds. The recruitment is the same move Cartman uses on Butters in a dozen other episodes, and it works for the same reason every time. Butters is not stupid, and he is not cruel. He is a child who has been taught to take adults and authority seriously, and Cartman has learned to imitate both. The threat about his parents is delivered while Butters is in the bath, with no escape and no time to think, which is a level of tactical planning the character applies to almost nothing else in his life. With Kyle out, Cartman recruits Butters instead, and he recruits him the way he always does, by telling him the Chinese are going to kill his parents. They form a two-person organization called the American Liberation Front and set out to gather intelligence. Their target is a P.F. Chang's. The restaurant choice is the sharpest thing in the episode, and it goes by fast. P.F. Chang's is an American chain, founded in Arizona, serving Americanized Chinese food in suburban shopping centers. It has roughly as much to do with the government of China as a pizza chain has to do with the government of Italy. Cartman, hunting for a foreign superpower, drives to a strip mall. His entire mental picture of a nation of over 1 billion people is a franchise restaurant near his house, which is a fairly precise description of how a lot of American panic about China actually works. Their reconnaissance mission collapses immediately. Cartman puts on a costume, does an impression, and fools nobody. Butters is armed and keeps discharging the weapon by accident injuring people in the same unfortunate location every time. What was supposed to be surveillance turns into a hostage situation, with police outside and a child with a gun inside. The sequence that follows is one of the more uncomfortable things the show had built by that point, and the discomfort is deliberate. Two children walk into a restaurant full of ordinary people eating dinner, armed, in costume, convinced they are conducting military reconnaissance. The staff and the diners are working and eating. Nobody in the building has done anything to anyone. Butters, who never wanted to be there and was recruited through a threat about his parents, keeps discharging the weapon by accident and injuring people, and his distress about it is played for laughs while the injuries stack up. Nothing in the scene lets the audience settle anywhere. The framing is farce, the events are a shooting, and the target of the entire operation is a suburban restaurant chain that has no connection to the thing Cartman is frightened of. The show holds that mixture for several minutes and never offers a way out of it, which is the same technique it used at the bus stop when it took Kyle away. Running underneath all of this is a second story about Kyle and the other boys, who have been left traumatized by a recent film. The show treats their experience of watching Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull as an assault, complete with flashbacks, therapy language, and a legal case against the two filmmakers responsible. It is a long and ugly metaphor about how fans talk about beloved franchises being ruined, and it is not really connected to the China material beyond one shared idea, which is that the whole town is worked up about something that did not happen to them. The ending is where the two stories meet. The police standoff outside the restaurant simply evaporates, because word arrives that the filmmakers have been arrested, and everybody would rather deal with that. Cartman and Butters walk out of a hostage situation completely unpunished, confused about why every adult around them is crying. Butters remarks that he thought the movie was fine. The collapse of the standoff deserves attention for how it is staged. There is no negotiation, no resolution, and no arrest. The police simply lose interest because a more compelling piece of news has arrived, and they leave. Two armed children walk out of a building they took by force, and nobody stops them or mentions it again. That is the show's real position on the panic it has spent the episode describing. The fear was never solid enough to hold anyone's attention past the next headline, and the damage done in its name gets absorbed and forgotten inside the same afternoon. It is a bleaker ending than the episode's reputation suggests, and it works because nobody in the town treats it as an ending at all. Nothing happens to Cartman. He suffers no consequence, learns nothing, and is not corrected by anyone at any point in the episode. That is deliberate. The show spent the whole episode removing every guardrail it normally uses, and then declined to put any of them back at the end. The argument for this kind of writing is the one Parker and Stone have made for decades. Cartman is the vessel. He is a 10-year-old sociopath. He is wrong about everything, and every episode is constructed so the audience laughs at him rather than with him. Handing the racism to the character, who is transparently the worst person in town, is a way of putting it on screen while making clear where the show stands. There is a further wrinkle here that complicates the defense, which is that the show removes Kyle on purpose and says so out loud while doing it. The usual arrangement depends on somebody in the room objecting. In this episode, the objection gets discussed, named as the thing that normally happens at this point, and then withheld. That is the writers demonstrating that they understand exactly what function Kyle performs, and then choosing to run 22 minutes without him performing it. Whether that counts as sophistication or as having it both ways is the question the whole season sits on. The show gets credit for understanding its own machinery, and it also gets to broadcast the material with the machinery switched off, inside the same episode. The argument against it runs into a problem specific to Cartman, rather than to the show in general. He is written to be laughed at, and he is also the most quoted character in the series by a wide margin. His accent work in this episode became one of the widely circulated pieces of season 12, repeated by people who liked it on its own terms and had no interest in the paranoia it was attached to. A character built as a warning and a character built to be imitated turn out to be difficult to keep separate once the episode is over. There is also the matter of what the episode is actually anxious about, because 2008 was a specific year to be anxious about China. The financial crisis was unfolding. American manufacturing had been moving overseas for 2 decades. Trade deficits were a nightly news subject. Chinese ownership of American debt was a recurring talking point. And in the middle of all of that, the country hosted the most expensive Olympics in history and put on a show designed to communicate that it had arrived. That autumn was not a normal moment to be broadcasting about national decline either. Lehman Brothers had collapsed 3 weeks before this episode aired. The federal government had taken over the 2 largest mortgage companies in the country the month before that. Congress had passed a bank rescue package days earlier. The presidential election was 4 weeks away, and both campaigns were talking constantly about American jobs going overseas. Against all of that, the picture of China circulating in American media was a country that manufactured everything, held an enormous quantity of American debt, and had just staged the most expensive display of organized capability in modern history. The panic this episode is making fun of had material sitting behind it, which is what makes the episode's position more interesting than a simple correction. It never argues that nothing is happening. It argues that the person most upset about it is a 10-year-old with no information, that his research consists of one trip to a chain restaurant, and that his response to a complicated economic relationship is to point a weapon at a waiter. The episode is built on that mood, and its position on it is that the mood is ridiculous, held by people who cannot locate the country on a map and whose research consists of a visit to a chain restaurant. The satire is aimed at American paranoia with real precision. The other thing this episode establishes is a habit the show kept. When South Park wants to make fun of American paranoia about a country, it sends a character to a place that country does not actually control. Cartman investigates China at a suburban chain restaurant. That structure repeats across the series with other subjects, and it works because the joke is never really about the foreign power. It is about how little any of the people worried about it have bothered to look. It is also an episode whose title is spelled in a mock accent, whose central set piece is a white child performing a caricature inside a Chinese restaurant, and whose most quoted moments are the caricature itself. Both of those things describe the same 22 minutes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A year later, a family celebrated a birthday at an aquarium in Denver. Men with spears came through the doors and killed everything in the tank. What follows is the darkest episode South Park ever built around Asia, and the explanation for all of it goes back to a photograph taken in August of 1945. Section 6, the whaling episode. Whale whores Stan Marsh turns 9 years old, and his family takes him to a public aquarium in Denver. He is in the water with the bottlenose dolphins, in the middle of a trainer demonstration, when a group of Japanese men armed with spears comes through the doors and kills every animal in the tank in front of him. That is the first 2 minutes of Whale Whores, which aired on October 28, 2009, as the 11th episode of Season 13 and the 192nd episode of the series. Written and directed by Trey Parker, the attacks continue from there. Other aquariums get hit. Then, during a live NFL broadcast from Miami, the same men come onto the field and kill members of the Miami Dolphins football team because of the name. Nobody in the episode stops them. Law enforcement does not intervene. The country simply absorbs it and moves on, which is its own joke about how little most people are willing to do about something they claim to care about. The episode was written in the middle of a real news cycle. Japanese whaling had been a live international story for years, and it had recently become television. A reality series called Whale Wars had been running on Animal Planet, following the activist Paul Watson and his crew as they harassed Japanese whaling vessels in the Southern Ocean. The show had a large audience and a persistent problem, which was that very little actually happened on it. Boats followed other boats. Things were thrown. Nothing changed. The dispute behind all of it is real and older than most of the audience. Commercial whaling was suspended worldwide by international agreement in the middle of the 1980s. Japan continued hunting under a clause permitting whaling for scientific research, and the meat from those hunts reached the market afterward, which is the arrangement critics spent decades describing as commercial whaling with paperwork attached. The hunts took place in the Southern Ocean, a very long way from anybody's coastline, which made them almost impossible to police and ideal for television. There was a second story running alongside it that year. A documentary about the dolphin hunt at a small Japanese coastal town had been released in the United States a few months before this episode aired, shot partly with hidden cameras, and it turned the subject from a policy dispute into something people watched and reacted to physically. It went on to win an Academy Award the following year. By the autumn of 2009, an American audience did not need any setup at all to understand what the men with spears in the opening scene were meant to represent. South Park puts Stan on that boat. He joins the crew, discovers that their tactics accomplish nothing whatsoever, and gets steadily more frustrated by a group of people who have built a television career out of failing at their stated goal. Watson himself is portrayed as ineffective, gets impaled, and dies. And the moment he is gone, the other characters happily insult him. Stan takes command and immediately starts sinking ships, which works, and the ratings for the program go through the roof, which brings Cartman and Kenny aboard now that there is fame attached. Paul Watson was a real person, and the show used his real name. He had founded the organization the series followed. He had spent decades ramming and obstructing whaling vessels, and he was one of the more divisive figures in environmental activism, treated as a hero by some and as a criminal by others. South Park kills him on screen inside the first half of the episode, has the surviving crew insult him immediately afterward, and then demonstrates that his replacement gets results in an afternoon by doing the one thing he never did, which is actually sinking something. That is a specific accusation rather than a general one. The episode's charge against the activists is not that they are wrong about whaling, it is that a television show about stopping whaling has a commercial reason to never stop whaling, because the day the hunts end is the day the series is canceled. Stan works that out by accident, fixes the problem in a week, and the ratings go up rather than down, which is the joke landing on the entire genre of activism built for broadcast. The middle of the episode runs a montage set to a Lady Gaga song, performed in character, during which the crew tries increasingly ridiculous methods of scaring the whaling fleet away, including building a fake Godzilla. It works. A Japanese fleet is driven off by a model of a monster from Japanese cinema, which is the kind of joke that only lands for people who know that Godzilla was created as an image of nuclear destruction in the first place. The Godzilla gag in that montage carries a second layer that most of the audience will pass straight over. Godzilla was created in Japan in 1954 as an image of nuclear destruction, a creature woken and mutated by atomic testing, made by people who had watched what happened to two of their own cities 9 years earlier. So when 4 American children scare off a Japanese fleet using a model of that specific monster, the episode is deploying a symbol of the bombing against the country that built it, roughly 10 minutes before the plot reveals that the bombing is what the entire conflict has been about. Whether that connection was deliberate or a coincidence of 2 jokes sitting near each other, it is the tightest piece of construction in the episode. The Miami Dolphins sequence works on a much simpler mechanism and is probably the most quoted thing in the episode. An entire professional football team is killed on live television because of the word on their shirts, and the show treats the confusion as reasonable. Nobody stops it. The broadcast continues. The joke is that a country capable of organizing an international hunting operation has been undone by a naming convention, and that America's response to a massacre at a sporting event is to keep filming it. The boys are eventually captured and taken to Japan, and the episode delivers its explanation. The reason Japan has been killing whales and dolphins, according to the emperor, is revenge. Not for anything the animals did in nature, for Hiroshima. After the bombing, the United States handed Japan a photograph of the aircraft that dropped the bomb, and in the photograph, the plane is being flown by a dolphin and a killer whale. Japan accepted the photograph, blamed the animals, and has been at war with them ever since. Relations between the two countries were repaired precisely because the Americans provided the evidence. Stan knows the picture is fake. He also works out that saying so would restart a war, so he goes the other direction. He phones Kyle, has a new fake photograph made showing a cow and a chicken in the cockpit, and presents it as the original that the government had been hiding. The Japanese officials are furious at having been deceived by livestock, call off all whaling immediately, and go directly to the nearest farms. The episode ends with Japanese hunters slaughtering cows and chickens by the thousand, and the American characters watching this happen with total comfort, because those are the animals it is normal to kill. That final turn is where the whole thing has been heading. Whaling comes out of the episode badly. So do the activists. What the ending goes after is the line Americans draw between the animals that are adorable and the animals that are food, and noting that the line has nothing to do with intelligence, suffering, or anything else people claim it does. Dolphins get a national outcry and a reality show. Chickens get a drive-through window. Multiple write-ups at the time picked up on that reading, along with the quieter point buried in the opening scene, which is that the aquariums where Americans go to admire dolphins are supplied by exactly the kind of capture operation the audience is meant to be horrified by. The aquarium detail in the opening deserves its own mention because of where it sits. The attack happens in the middle of a demonstration, with children in the water and a trainer running the show, at exactly the kind of venue American families visit, specifically to feel close to these animals. Those venues are supplied by capture operations, and the drives that supply them are the same drives the episode is built around. The show puts the horror in the one place the audience associates with a nice day out, and never explains the connection. That is a sharp piece of satire, and it is aimed squarely at the people watching. It is also the second time in 10 years that this show explained the behavior of an entire nation by pointing at the Second World War. Shin Pokemon ran on Pearl Harbor. Whale Whores runs on Hiroshima. In both cases, the Japanese characters are written as a single unit with a single grievance, acting together, unable to be reasoned with, and moving as a mob. In this episode, they arrive in numbers with spears, they perform suicide attacks against the activist ship, and the entire population is shown to have accepted an obviously doctored photograph for over 60 years without one person examining it. The nation is written as easily fooled, permanently angry, and organized around revenge. The kamikaze material belongs in the same column. The Japanese fleet responds to the activists by flying aircraft into their ship, which is a direct callback to the final year of the Pacific War, deployed here as an action beat with no comment attached. It is the third separate wartime reference the episode leans on, after the reason for the whaling and the monster in the montage, and it lands in a story that is otherwise about a documentary crew and a reality television contract. The atomic bomb sits at the center of that as a comedy engine. Cartman finds the destruction of a city hilarious and says so. The show is clearly aware of how far it is reaching, and reaches anyway, because that has always been the operating principle. There is one more thing in this episode that separates it from the show's other work on Japan, which is who gets depicted. The character delivering the explanation is the emperor, drawn and voiced as himself, along with the sitting prime minister, both real people holding real offices at the time of broadcast. The show had spent years putting real politicians and celebrities on screen, so the choice is consistent with everything else it does. It still means the resolution of the plot involves a living head of state being personally fooled by a photograph of a cow. There is a pattern across both of these Japan episodes worth naming before moving on. In each one, the country is written as one creature. It acts together, believes the same thing, and reaches the same conclusion at the same moment, whether that conclusion is a toy company plot or a 60-year grudge against a species. No Japanese character in either episode disagrees with another Japanese character about anything. That is the oldest move in the caricature handbook, and it is doing quiet work underneath both stories, regardless of how sharp the satire built on top of it happens to be. Nothing came of it. There was no diplomatic complaint, no formal response, and no organized campaign against the episode, which is worth noting against what happened 10 years later when the show aimed at a different government in a different country. The difference was never about how insulting the material was, it was about which government was watching. Whale Horrors was well received and is frequently named among the strongest episodes of its season. The environmental press covered it. The point about the meat industry got quoted for years afterward. It is, by most measures, a successful episode. The final scene is also more pointed than its reputation suggests. The Japanese hunters do not stop killing. They redirect, immediately and enthusiastically, toward cows and chickens, and the American characters watching them do it are visibly relieved. Nothing has been solved. One set of animals has been swapped for another, and everybody has agreed to be comfortable about it, which means the episode's happy ending is a group of Americans watching a slaughter and finding it acceptable because the animals are the correct ones. It is also an episode in which every Japanese character on screen is a faceless killer motivated by a war that ended 64 years before it aired, and in which the resolution comes from tricking them a second time with a second fake photograph, because the show's position is that they will believe anything they are shown. The satire and the caricature are not in different parts of the episode. They are the same scenes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years later, a sushi restaurant opened next door to City Walk, and the fight between the two owners took up most of the episode. Almost nobody watching realized the show was setting up a confession about a joke it had been telling for 9 straight years. Section 7, The Reveal, City Sushi Butters, is handing out flyers on the sidewalk for a new restaurant. Nobody wants one. He offers one to the owner of City Walk, who reads it, learns that a Japanese sushi place has opened directly next to his business, and goes across the street to start a fight. City Sushi aired on June 1st, 2011, as the 6th episode of season 15 and the 215th episode of the series, written by Trey Parker. It is built out of pieces of horror films, borrowing from Psycho, from the found footage style of Paranormal Activity, and most of all from a thriller called Identity, which matters because of where the story ends up. The fight between the two restaurant owners is the surface of the episode. Tuong Lu Kim and the new arrival, a Japanese man named Junichi Takayama, cannot understand a word the other one says. They are both speaking English. Their accents are thick enough in opposite directions that the conversation goes nowhere, and Takayama, unable to follow anything being shouted at him, offers to sell his neighbor a tuna roll. The film references running through it are chosen with more care than usual. The house sequences borrow directly from Psycho. The surveillance footage of Butters asleep in his own bedroom copies the visual language of Paranormal Activity, and the structure of the whole thing comes from a thriller called Identity, a film whose entire premise is that a group of separate people turn out to be personalities inside one man. Building an episode on that particular skeleton is the writers telling the audience the answer 20 minutes early, in a language only some of them speak. The police blame Butters for the whole thing, on the grounds that his flyer started what they refer to as an Asian turf war, and he gets sent for a psychological evaluation. That is where the second story begins. A psychiatrist named Dr. Janice diagnoses Butters with multiple personality disorder, which Butters does not have, and then proceeds to make the diagnosis look correct by kidnapping him and putting him into criminal situations under different identities. The doctor is the one with the condition, and he has no idea. The Butters half of the story is far darker than it first looks, and it is easy to lose next to the restaurant material. He is sent to a facility for criminally insane children on the strength of handing out a flyer. The psychiatrist evaluating him produces a diagnosis for a condition he does not have, then goes out and manufactures evidence for it by taking him out of his house at night and putting him inside a robbery. Footage exists of the doctor standing over the sleeping boy. The police sergeant handling it never questions any of it and leans on the parents to punish their son harder. Every adult with authority over Butters in this episode uses it to make his situation worse, and none of them are ever held responsible for it. There is also a detail hidden in the sushi restaurant that most viewers miss on a first watch. A sign on the wall states that management reserves the right to refuse service to Chinese customers. Takayama serves his neighbor happily anyway, which reads as a small contradiction until the ending arrives and explains it. The sign was never violated. The man he served was not Chinese. Meanwhile, the restaurant fight escalates past anything the town expected. What sets Lu Kim off most is not the competition. It is that everybody in South Park keeps treating Chinese and Japanese as interchangeable, folding two countries into one category and assuming the two men have something in common. He is enraged by it, and the episode treats his rage as correct. His response is to give a presentation at the school. He stands in front of children and walks them through what Japan did in China during the Second World War, using historical photographs, and then moves on to remarks about suicide rates in Japan. It is real history deployed as a weapon inside a cartoon feud, and it is the most information about East Asia that this show had ever put on screen in one place. What he presents at that assembly is real history, and it is worth being clear about how real. Japan invaded China in the 1930s, and the war that followed ran until 1945 and killed civilians in numbers that are still argued over because the true figure was never fully counted. The occupation produced events that remain among the most serious war crimes of the 20th century. Relations between the two countries have never fully recovered from it, and disputes about how that history is taught in Japanese schools still cause diplomatic incidents in the present day. American audiences are, as a rule, not taught any of this. The Second World War, as it is understood in the United States, starts in December of 1941 and takes place mostly in Europe and the Pacific, with China appearing as a footnote if it appears at all. So an American cartoon stopping to explain to a room of children that a Chinese man might have specific and legitimate reasons to hate a Japanese man is doing something that almost nothing else on American television was doing. The information is accurate. It is delivered by a lunatic in an accent as part of a plan to commit murder, and it is still the most East Asian history this show ever put on screen at once. Then he fakes a truce. He proposes building a tower of peace between the two restaurants as a symbol of reconciliation, invites Takayama to the top of it, and plans to push him off on the theory that a Japanese man falling from a height will be assumed to be a suicide and nobody will investigate. While that is being set up, Butters escapes from Dr. Janice and searches his house. He finds a room. The walls are covered in defaced posters and flyers for City Sushi, scratched out, marked up, obsessed over. Tuong Lu Kim is one of Dr. Janice's personalities. There is no Chinese restaurant owner in South Park. There never was. Janice is a wealthy white psychiatrist who has spent years convincing an entire town that he is a Chinese immigrant by squinting his eyes and performing an accent, and the town has accepted it completely for the better part of a decade. What makes the reveal work as staging rather than as a twist is that the town watches it happen. This is not a private discovery handed to the audience. Every resident of South Park is standing at a festival when a man they have known for 9 years stops being the person they thought he was, in front of them, mid-sentence. Nobody in the crowd reacts with much of anything, which is its own comment. They had never looked closely enough in the first place for the change to register. The reveal arrives at the tower with the police, who show up as Lu Kim is about to push Takayama over the edge. In front of the entire town, he changes personality in plain sight, and everybody watches a white man stop being Chinese. Takayama, standing there, processes what he has just learned. He has been at war for the entire episode with a white man in a costume, and he never once noticed. The shame of that is more than he can carry, and he jumps from the tower, landing on the roof of his own restaurant. On the way down, he criticizes himself for being stereotypical. The police then have a short conversation about what to do. They conclude that the town already has enough therapists and that it does not have another Chinese restaurant, and they decide to leave the Lu Kim personality in charge so that City Walk can stay open. Everything goes back to exactly the way it was. That ending is the whole episode. Consider what the show had actually just done. 9 years earlier, it built a character whose entire function was an accent performed by a white man. In 2011, it revealed, inside the story, that the character is a white man performing an accent. The fiction and the production were made to match. The joke everyone had been repeating since 2002 was reclassified, on screen, as exactly what its critics had always said it was. There are two ways to read that, and both have been argued ever since. The first reading is that this is a confession. The show looked at its own most criticized creation, agreed with the criticism, and wrote the criticism into canon in the most permanent way available. It is an unusual thing for a comedy to do. Most shows in that position either quietly stop using the character or issue a statement years later. This one built an episode around admitting it. The second reading is less flattering. Making the character a white man in a costume does not remove the voice from television. It supplies a reason to keep doing it forever. And the show goes further than that, because the final scene has law enforcement formally authorize the performance to continue on the grounds that the town needs the food. The episode ends with an official permission slip. Lu Kim keeps appearing for years afterward, still voiced the same way, still doing the same accent, now with a canonical explanation attached that answers any objection before it is raised. The timing matters for how the episode was received. In 2011, the argument about white performers voicing characters of color was live, but nowhere near the volume it reached later in the decade. The conversation that eventually forced changes across American animation was still years away, so this episode did not arrive as a response to pressure. There was very little pressure yet. The show diagnosed the problem with its own character before the industry got around to diagnosing it, which is the strongest thing anyone can say in its favor. What the show did with that head start is the part that stays complicated. Having identified the issue years early, it chose to build the identification into the character permanently rather than change anything about how he was performed. The Doctor mentions having run the deception on the town for 7 years, which is roughly how long the character had been on the air. The show was counting. Which reading holds up depends mostly on what somebody thinks a confession is for. If the point is understanding, the episode delivers. If the point is stopping, it does the opposite, and does it on purpose. The tower he is pushed from is also a joke about the town, rather than about either man. It is called a Tower of Peace, built quickly, celebrated at a festival, and erected between two businesses whose owners have been at war for the whole episode. Nobody in South Park questions why a monument to reconciliation is going up in a week, because building a structure and holding a ceremony is easier than resolving anything. The tower does exactly one thing in the story, which is give somebody a height to fall from. Then there is Takayama, and this is the part of the episode that has aged worst by a wide margin. The show constructs a character around a specific stereotype about Japanese people and shame, uses that stereotype as the mechanism of his death, and has him name the stereotype out loud while he is falling. Reading it generously, the joke is on people who believe the stereotype, and the character calling it out mid-air is the show refusing to let anyone take it seriously. Reading it plainly, a Japanese man kills himself over embarrassment in a comedy, and the episode gets its final laugh from it. One more detail is worth having, because it decides how the joke reads. Trey Parker performs both restaurant owners. The scene in which a Chinese man and a Japanese man cannot understand one another despite both speaking English is one performer talking to himself in two accents he invented. Once the ending arrives and establishes that one of those men was a white American doing an impression, the other one is left standing there as the last unexplained accent in the room, still performed by the same person, with no reveal attached to him at all. City Sushi is the hinge of this entire subject. It is the moment South Park stopped and looked directly at what it had been doing with Asian characters for 9 years, described it accurately, and then chose to keep doing it with the description attached. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 years later, South Park Elementary filled up with new students, and the school held an assembly to celebrate them. What the assembly celebrated was an art form nobody in the room understood, and the pictures on the projector screen were drawn by real fans who had mailed them in. Section 8, the background kids, Kevin Stoley, the Asian girls, and Tweek X Craig. There is a boy who has been sitting in the 4th grade classroom at South Park Elementary since the early seasons. His name is Kevin Stoley. He is Asian American. He is in the background of hundreds of scenes, and across more than 2 decades of television, he has been given almost nothing to do. What the show has decided about him is that he likes Star Wars. That is the character. He turns up in crowd shots, he occasionally speaks a line, and he goes back to being furniture. Kevin does get one thing that most background children never receive, which is a consistent interest the writers remember. He is the Star Wars boy. He turns up with the toys, he knows the material, and in a handful of episodes across 2 decades, the show has used that for a line or a visual. It is real characterization, and it is also the entire inventory. Sitting near him is a cluster of girls the show has never bothered to individually develop, referred to collectively by the fandom and by the show's own materials as the Asian girls. They are drawn as a group. They function as a group. For most of the series, they exist to fill out a classroom. It is worth measuring that against how the show treats its other background children. Butters started as a filler kid in the 2nd season and became one of the most developed characters in the series, with a family, an alter ego, an emotional life, and dozens of episodes built around him. Craig started as a boy who made a rude gesture and now has a long-term relationship the show takes seriously. Jimmy and Timmy both arrived as one joke and both ended up with storylines about ambition, friendship, and being underestimated. The show has a proven habit of picking somebody out of the crowd and building a person around them. That habit has never once landed on Kevin Stoley. Across more than 300 episodes, he has been given a hobby and nothing else. Nobody at the studio ever appears to have decided anything about him beyond the fact that he is there and he likes spaceships. In October of 2015, the show built an entire episode on top of them. Tweek X Craig aired on October 28, 2015, as the 6th episode of season 19 and the 263rd episode of the series, written and directed by Trey Parker. It landed in the middle of the season, built around PC Principal. The character introduced that year here as a walking parody of aggressive campus-style progressivism, and the season's running subject was the town trying very hard to be correct about things it did not understand. Season 19 had already been running jokes about the school's changing population before this. The gentrification story earlier in the year, the advertising story, and the assembly here all share the same underlying observation, which is that a town can rearrange every visible part of itself and change nothing about how it actually thinks. The school celebrates its new students with a presentation. The town builds a fashionable district next to a struggling restaurant. In both cases, the surface moves and the substance does not. The episode opens at a school assembly. Wendy Testaberger gives a presentation about the culture of the school's Asian students, whose numbers have gone up, and introduces the room to an art form the assembly is meant to appreciate and respect. The art form is yaoi, a genre of Japanese comics depicting romantic and sexual relationships between male characters, made largely by and for women. Then she starts the slideshow. Every image is Tweek and Craig, two boys in the 4th grade, drawn by their classmates, in poses that begin sweet and do not stay that way. The entire school sits there while the pictures advance. Tweek and Craig are in the room. The origin of it goes back to 1999. An early episode had the boys manufacture a fight between Tweek and Craig purely for entertainment, forcing two children who had no argument with each other into a schoolyard brawl. Something about the pairing stuck. Fans started drawing the two of them together and never stopped. And by 2015, 16 years of accumulated fan work existed around a relationship that had never appeared in a single frame of the actual show. What the producers did with that is unusual. Rather than commissioning an imitation of the art, they put out a public call asking the audience to send in their own drawings of the two characters in that style, and the submissions were used in the finished episode. The response was large enough that the art press wrote about it at the time. So the slideshow the 4th grade sits through, drawn in the story by the school's Asian students, was in reality drawn by the show's own viewers and mailed in, which means the episode's central joke about a fandom producing enormous quantities of romantic art about two cartoon boys was assembled out of exactly that. That premise came from real life, and the show did something unusual to build it. Tweek and Craig had been paired off by fans since an episode in 1999 that put the two of them in a fistfight, and 16 years of fan art had accumulated around them. Rather than draw an imitation of that art, the producers publicly asked the audience to submit their own, and the slideshow in the finished episode is made of real drawings sent in by real fans. The art press covered the open call at the time. A show about a school assembly displaying fan art was itself displaying fan art. Season 19 is also the reason the episode looks the way it does. That year, the show abandoned its usual standalone format and ran a continuous story across all 10 episodes, with the town being remade around the arrival of PC Principal, a gentrification project, and advertising that had learned to disguise itself as news. Every episode fed the next one. Inside that structure, the assembly about the Asian students is not a random scene. It sits in a season whose whole subject is a town performing correctness at high volume while understanding nothing, and it uses the same machinery as everything around it. The plot from there is about the two boys trying to make the rumors stop. They decide to fake a relationship so they can stage a public breakup, which goes wrong when Tweek commits too hard to the performance and invents an affair to accuse Craig of. The whole town takes sides. Craig's father struggles with his son's supposed identity. Randy phones the Chinese government looking for an explanation about homosexuality, which goes about as well as expected. Cartman spends the episode arguing with a personified version of his own romantic impulses. Wendy is also worth a mention because she is the one running the assembly. She is the character the show has always used when it wants somebody competent and well-intentioned to be completely wrong, and here she is presenting other people's culture to a room without asking any of them how they would like it presented. The joke is not that she is malicious, it is that the presentation was always going to be about her. By the end, the fake relationship has become a real one, and the show treats it straight. Tweek and Craig stay together after this episode. They appear as a couple in later seasons and in the games. A joke that started as a fistfight in 1999 turned into one of the few sincere relationships the show has ever maintained, and the fanbase that spent 16 years drawing it got told, officially, that they were right. The ending is also the thing people remembered. Two boys who spent the episode faking a relationship to escape a rumor discovered partway through that the fake had stopped being fake, and the show plays that turn without a single joke undercutting it. Craig's father, who spent the episode struggling, comes around. The town celebrates. A series that had spent 19 years treating sincerity as a weakness delivered one of the most sincere endings it had ever written, and it did it inside an episode that opened with a slideshow of pornographic fan art in a school gymnasium. That relationship has held ever since. Tweek and Craig appear as a couple in later seasons, in the specials, and in the games, and the show has never walked it back or played it for a joke afterward. Matt Stone picked up an Emmy nomination for voice work connected to that season. Whatever else the episode is doing with the girls who set the plot in motion, the thing thing it produced has outlasted almost everything else from that year. So where do the Asian girls sit inside all of that? The satire of the episode is not aimed at them, it is aimed at the town. Wendy's presentation is delivered in the language of a diversity assembly, treating the girls as a cultural exhibit to be honored, and the joke is that nobody in the room has any idea what they are honoring until it is already on the screen. PC Principal enforces respect for a thing he has not looked at. The adults panic, take positions, and give speeches about a subject none of them understand. PC Principal is the other half of that machinery, and the season's best single idea. He is not a hypocrite. He believes every word of it, enforces it physically, and has no interest whatsoever in whether any of it helps the people it is supposedly for. Putting him in charge of an assembly celebrating a culture he has not examined is the cleanest version of the joke the season kept returning to, which is that enthusiasm and understanding have nothing to do with each other. That is a fair and specific joke about performative multiculturalism, and it lands. The girls themselves, though, get exactly the treatment they always get. They are a group. They are identified by ethnicity rather than by name. Their function in the story is to produce a foreign art form that the white characters then have to react to. When the episode needs them to be a market, they set up a tent and sell prints. They are not people in this episode. They are a cultural resource that the plot draws from. A critic reviewing it at the time landed on the phrase that describes the whole season best, arguing that what the show is really attacking is people following a trend without doing any research on it. That reading covers the entire episode, including the parts that appear to be about sexuality. Nobody in the town has a fixed opinion about Tweek and Craig. They have whatever opinion the room around them currently holds, updated hourly, delivered with total confidence. The girls producing the art are the only people in the episode who actually understand the thing everybody else is arguing about, and nobody asks them anything, which is a small thing next to the show's louder material, and it is also the more common thing. The accent jokes get written about because they are loud. This is quieter. 26 seasons of a boy defined entirely by liking Star Wars, and a group of girls defined entirely by being from somewhere else is a different kind of pattern than a mispronounced restaurant name, and it runs underneath the whole series without ever generating an argument. Set that against Kevin Stoley one more time, and the imbalance is easier to see. The show was willing to build a full episode around what a group of Asian students produce, and it has never been willing to spend one scene on what one of them wants. The art was interesting to the writers. The people making it were scenery. The same year gave a decent example of the loud version still running at full strength. In an episode from earlier in season 19, the town builds a fashionable new district next to City Walk, and the neighborhood ruins Lou Kim's business by pulling every customer away. His solution is to renovate his restaurant using child labor, a joke pointed directly at Chinese manufacturing. 4 years after the show revealed that this character is a white man in a costume, the character was still there, still voiced identically, still delivering jokes built on the same material as before. Nothing about the reveal changed how the character was used. It only changed what the show could say if anybody asked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 years after that, the show stopped making jokes about Chinese characters and started making jokes about the Chinese government instead. Within 5 days, every trace of South Park had been deleted from the Chinese internet, and the two men who run the show responded with a statement that was somehow worse than the episode. Section 9, The Ban, Banned in China. The title works two ways at once, which is the first sign that this episode had been thought about carefully. Read one way, it is a banned in China. Read the other way, it is a show banned in China. Within a week of broadcast, the second reading had come true. Banned in China aired on October 2nd, 2019, as the second episode of season 23 and the 299th episode of the series, written and directed by Trey Parker. The band plot starts small. 4 boys form a metal group, which the show plays for the ordinary comedy of children being loud, and then the story escalates the way modern entertainment escalates, from a band to a brand to a film about the band before any of them has done anything worth filming. The biopic exists before the career does, which is a joke about the American music industry that the episode gets to make on its way to the real subject. It runs 2 stories. In the first, Stan starts a metal band with Kenny, Butters, and Jimmy, and the band does well enough that a studio offers to make a biopic about them. The offer comes with conditions, because the film needs to be approved for release in China, and the approval process reshapes everything. Content gets cut, characters get changed, subject matter gets softened. The band watches its own story get rewritten by people who are not in the room, in a country they have never visited, for reasons nobody involved is willing to say out loud. The camp material is where the episode stops being funny in the ordinary sense. Randy is put to work, made to recite political material, and held with other prisoners in conditions the episode presents flatly rather than as farce. Reporting on the internment system in the far west of the country had been building through 2018 and 2019, with satellite imagery, leaked documents, and testimony putting the number of people held at somewhere above 1 million. That reporting programming was widely available and almost entirely absent from American entertainment. Putting it inside a cartoon about a man selling marijuana was the only route it was going to take onto a comedy channel. In the second story, Randy Marsh flies to China to expand his marijuana business, gets caught selling, and is sent to a prison work camp. The camp is where the episode does its sharpest work. It draws directly on reporting about the internment system in Xinjiang, and it puts Randy through forced labor and political re-education alongside other prisoners. One of those prisoners is Winnie the Pooh. That is not a random choice. Chinese internet users had spent years comparing Xi Jinping to the character, and the government had responded by censoring the comparison, to the point that a Disney film featuring the character was denied a release in the country in 2018. Putting Pooh in a Chinese prison camp is a joke that only exists because a government decided a cartoon bear was a political problem. The practice the episode is describing was documented and specific, and by 2019, there was a long list of examples for anyone who wanted one. Studios had recast characters whose original ethnicity was politically awkward. Films had removed references to Taiwan and Tibet. A zombie film had its outbreak relocated away from China. Concert films had cut footage. Release decisions were being shaped by a review process nobody outside it could see, applied to films made for audiences thousands of miles away, and the studios involved almost never acknowledged that any of it was happening. Two things made the arrangement work. The Chinese box office had grown into the largest or second largest in the world depending on the year, large enough that a film could fail domestically and still profit, and the review process operated without published rules, which meant studios could not simply comply with a standard. They had to guess, and guessing conservatively is always safer than guessing accurately. The result was an American film industry quietly editing itself against a standard nobody had ever written down. The target of the whole episode is not China, it is Hollywood. The band plot is entirely about American studios shaping American entertainment to satisfy a censor they will not admit they are answering to, and the show is blunt about the exchange being made. The episode's position is that access to that market costs a specific amount of freedom, and that everybody involved knows the price and pays it quietly. The episode's own version of that is the biopic plot, and it is built out of the mechanics rather than the politics. The band does not get told what to remove, they get told what will not be approved, which is a different thing and a much more effective one, because it moves the decision inside the room. Nobody has to censor anybody. The people making the film simply arrive at the correct answer on their own, in advance, and then describe it as a creative choice. That distinction is the sharpest observation in the episode, and it is delivered almost in passing. The timing turned out to be extraordinary, and the sequence of events that week is worth laying out in order, because the coincidence is difficult to believe. The episode aired on Wednesday, the 2nd of October. 2 days later, the general manager of the Houston Rockets posted a short message supporting the protests in Hong Kong. The Chinese response was immediate and severe. Broadcasters dropped games, sponsors withdrew, and the basketball league issued a statement that a large number of Americans across the political spectrum read as an apology to a foreign government for something one of its employees had said. By that Monday, the story was the biggest thing in American sports, so an episode arguing that American institutions quietly surrender their principles for access to the Chinese market aired 4 days before one of the largest American institutions did precisely that, on the record, in front of everybody. No satirist gets that lucky twice. The two stories then ran together for weeks. American politicians who agreed on nothing else found themselves agreeing about the basketball league. Commentators who had never watched an episode of this show started citing it. For a short stretch in October of 2019, a cartoon about a children's metal band was being referenced in arguments about foreign policy, which is not a position South Park had occupied before and has not occupied since. Then Beijing responded to the show itself. Within days, South Park was scrubbed from the Chinese internet. Episodes and clips disappeared from streaming services. Discussion vanished from Baidu Tieba and from the film rating site Douban. A search on Weibo, a platform with billions of posts, turned up nothing. Reuters reported that 2 large streaming sites still listed episodes in their catalogs, but the episodes would not actually play. The Hollywood Reporter described the show as conspicuously absent everywhere it had previously had a presence. Requests for comment from the platforms and from the internet regulator went unanswered. The apology is also constructed carefully enough to be worth reading twice. Every line in it is an acceptable statement that any studio might have released, arranged in an order that makes the whole thing an accusation. It agrees with the censors. It affirms the resemblance question in the negative. It praises the governing party and wishes the country a good harvest. Nothing in it is technically insulting. What it does is take the exact register of a corporate apology to a foreign government and hold it up next to a real one that had been issued days earlier, so the two can be compared. On October 7th, Parker and Stone posted a response through the show's account, formatted as an official apology to China. It is one of the more remarkable pieces of writing either of them has put out. out. They welcome the censors warmly. They agree that money matters more than freedom and democracy. They confirm that Xi bears no resemblance to Winnie the Pooh. They wish the country a good sorghum harvest. They mention the NBA, and in the middle of it, they plug the following week's 300th episode, so the apology doubles as an advertisement. The response got picked up worldwide within hours. A lawyer who works with Chinese companies in the United States told reporters at the time that the episode was about as deliberate a provocation as anyone could manage, and that the censors reacting to it was entirely predictable. The scale of the deletion is the part that gets understated. This was not an episode being pulled. Every episode went, along with clips, fan pages, discussion threads, and the show's name itself as a searchable term. A program that had been circulating in the country for over 20 years through unofficial channels with a large and established audience was removed from the visible internet of a nation of more than 1 billion people inside a few days. Nothing was announced. No order was published. The material simply stopped being there, which is a more effective demonstration of the episode's argument than anything the episode itself contained. Parker and Stone would have understood exactly what they were buying. By 2019, they had been through this cycle repeatedly, most seriously after 2 episodes involving depictions of Muhammad, one of which drew threats serious enough that the network censored the broadcast without their agreement. They have been living with the consequences of that for years. Set against it, losing an audience that was never officially theirs, in a market that had never paid them, was close to a free shot, and the response they posted reads like 2 people who knew precisely how little it cost. The real cost to the show was close to nothing. South Park was never officially licensed in China. Its audience there had always been watching pirated copies. There was no revenue stream to lose. Some reporting afterwards suggested the ban made the show less attractive to certain buyers in the streaming rights market, which is the closest thing to a consequence anybody has identified. Whether the show cared about any of that is a separate question. Parker and Stone have never presented themselves as political actors and have spent 25 years refusing to be recruited by anybody. An academic writing about the episode afterward argued that it functioned as an instrument of American soft power against an authoritarian government, which is the kind of description that would probably horrify both of them. The more likely explanation is simpler. A government had made a subject untouchable, the American entertainment industry had agreed to leave it alone, and that combination has been catnip to these 2 men since the 1990s. What makes this episode worth its place in this story is how different it is from everything that came before it. 20 years of South Park engaging with China had run on the same fuel: the accent, the restaurant, the mafia, the invasion panic, the wall, and the Mongolians. Every one of those jokes worked by pointing at Chinese people and finding something funny in how they looked or sounded or were imagined by Americans. The 2 approaches are worth putting side by side one final time, because the difference is not a matter of taste. Making fun of a Chinese restaurant owner's pronunciation costs nothing, requires no research, and produces a laugh that will still be repeated in a school hallway a decade later. Making fun of a censorship regime requires knowing what the regime actually does, produces a much smaller and colder laugh, and gets a television show deleted from a continent. The show did both, 20 years apart, and only one of them made anybody in power notice. Banned in China contains none of that. There is no accent gag at its center. There is no caricature carrying the punchline. The episode is about a government's censorship apparatus, about the specific mechanics of political repression, and about American cowardice in the face of a large market. It is aimed at power rather than at people, and it is the most substantive thing the show ever said about the country. The episode has also not been quietly forgotten by the people who made it. The following week's 300th episode aired as planned. The show has stayed banned. Later seasons continued making jokes at the expense of the same government, and Parker and Stone have kept referring to the ban in interviews as something closer to an achievement than a problem, none of which changes the underlying arithmetic. A show can afford to do this exactly once, and only if it has nothing to lose. And the reason so few American productions have followed is that almost all of them have a great deal to lose. That is the point the episode was making before any of it happened, and the year since has done nothing to weaken it. It is also, by a wide margin, the episode that got the strongest reaction. 20 years of caricature-produced arguments in comment sections. One episode about censorship got the entire series deleted from a country of more than 1 billion people. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 years later, the show made an episode where the entire plot revolves around a Japanese product, and something is missing from it. There is no accent, there is no caricature, there is no war. Whatever changed between 1999 and 2023 shows up most clearly in what the writers stopped putting on screen. Section 10, What It Left Behind, Japanese toilet and the long pattern. The toilet in the guest bathroom at the Marsh house stops working, and Randy will not let it go. He has named it. He buried it in the yard once. Sharon tells him to buy a new one and threatens his business if he refuses, so he drives to Home Depot, where a salesman mentions that they carry Japanese toilets and warns him about the price. nice. The product at the center of it is real, and the episode is broadly accurate about it. Electronic toilets with built-in bidets, heated seats, and controls on the wall have been standard equipment in Japanese homes since the late 1980s, to the point that the great majority of households have one, and visitors regularly write about the experience of using one for the first time. They have never caught on in the United States in any comparable way. Americans buy paper. The gap between the two markets is enormous, well documented, and has nothing to do with the technology being unavailable. There was also a very recent American memory attached to the subject. 3 years before this episode, the country had emptied every shelf of toilet paper in a matter of days during the early panic of the pandemic, and images of people fighting in supermarkets over it had gone around the world. An episode built on the argument that America has an irrational relationship with a paper product was not reaching for something obscure. Randy takes that warning as an insult, insists he is not poor, and gets led to a separate boutique inside the store with its own staff, where the toilets have heated seats, built-in bidets, Bluetooth, and mood music. Japanese Toilet aired on March 1st, 2023, as the third episode of season 26, written and directed by Trey Parker. What happens next is a standard Randy story. He buys the expensive thing, becomes insufferable about it, and turns it into a status symbol. He tells everyone in town. Kids at school start treating Stan as a spoiled rich brat over a bathroom fixture the boy never mentioned. Randy then decides he has a mission and starts campaigning for Americans to abandon toilet paper entirely, which puts him directly in the path of the companies that sell it. The status material in the middle is the part doing the real work. Randy does not buy the toilet because he wants one. He buys it because a salesman implied he could not afford it, which is the entire transaction. Then, he needs everybody to know about it, and the show tracks the consequences of that down to his son, who says nothing to anybody and gets treated at school as a rich kid, flaunting his money because of a fixture in a bathroom nobody at that school has seen. That is a familiar Randy shape, and the show has run it many times, with weed, with wine, with a boat. What makes this version worth pulling out is what supplies the status. In an earlier decade, the show would have found the comedy in the object being foreign and strange. Here, the object is foreign and better. Everybody in the episode understands that it is better, and the humor comes entirely from what Americans do to each other once one of them owns a nicer thing. The paper industry deals with him the way South Park industries always deal with a problem. Randy gets shot. His proctologist is driven to death. It emerges that another character had been targeted by the same people 2 years earlier. Randy folds completely, digs his old toilet back out of the ground, reinstalls it, and closes the episode with a moral about how owning one nice thing only makes a person want more nice things, which he delivers immediately before insulting his wife by accident. That closing lesson is nonsense, and the episode knows it, because what actually happened is that an industry threatened his life and he surrendered. Nothing he says at the end has anything to do with the reason he quit. The show lets him narrate a comfortable explanation over the top of a plain defeat, which is what people generally do after losing to something bigger than they are. Now look at what is not in that episode. There is no accent. There are no Japanese characters at all. There is no caricature, no bowing, no flattery, no wartime callback, no reference to any conflict between the two countries. Japan appears in this episode as a place that manufactures a better product than America does, and the joke runs entirely on American consumers, American status anxiety, and an American industry willing to shoot a man to protect its market share. 24 years earlier, the same show made an episode in which Japanese executives brainwashed American children into attacking Pearl Harbor. That distance is the clearest thing in this whole subject, and it happened without any announcement. Nobody at the studio issued a statement about changing course. The show simply stopped needing a caricature to get a Japanese premise on screen, somewhere in the long stretch between those two episodes. The years around 2020 are the useful comparison, because almost every other show in this position moved. The performer who had voiced Apu on The Simpsons stepped away from the role after a documentary and several years of argument, and the show announced it would no longer cast white actors as characters of color. Family Guy's Cleveland was recast. Performers on Big Mouth and Central Park gave up roles they had originated. Across about 18 months, a substantial part of American animation quietly changed how it cast, in most cases without waiting to be forced. South Park sat all of it out. No statement was issued, no role changed hands, and no character was retired. Trey Parker kept voicing Tuong Lu Kim, and the character kept appearing, including through the pandemic specials. In the middle of that same stretch, the studio signed one of the largest deals in television history, worth several $100 million, for more seasons and a run of feature-length specials. Whatever pressure existed elsewhere in the industry did not reach this show, and the commercial position it was negotiating from suggests fairly clearly why. The Chinese half of the story went differently, because the Chinese half of the story had a character attached to it. Tuong Lu Kim was never recast. Trey Parker still voices him. Around 2020, when a long list of animated shows recast or retired characters of color who had been voiced by white performers. South Park did not participate in that at all. City Walk stayed open. The character kept appearing through the pandemic specials and beyond, doing the same voice he had done since 2002. It is worth being precise about what that reveal did and did not do. It did not remove a single accent from the show. It did not change who performed it. What it changed was the sentence the writers could say if anybody asked, and that sentence has done a great deal of work ever since. Every argument about the character now runs into the same wall, which is that the show got there first and wrote the criticism into the story. The reason the show could hold that line is the reveal in City Sushi. Once the character was written as a white man performing a Chinese identity, every objection had a canonical answer waiting for it. That was either the most honest thing the show ever did or the most convenient, and the show has never shown much interest in clarifying which. Look at the whole run together, and a shape appears. There are two South Parks in this story, and they operated at the same time out of the same building. Something else worth naming is the shape of who actually appears. Across more than 300 episodes, the Asian characters who get any interior life at all can be counted quickly. There is a restaurant owner who turned out to be a white man. There is his wife, voiced by a real singer, who exists mostly to sing. There is a Japanese restaurateur who lasted one episode and died at the end of it. There is a boy in the classroom who likes Star Wars, and a group of girls identified by where their families are from. Set that against how many Asian people live in an average American town of that size, and against how thoroughly this show has developed its white background characters over the same period, and the pattern is not really about any individual joke. Nobody at the studio ever had to decide against building an Asian character with a full life. It simply never came up as an idea worth having. The first one built jokes out of how Asian people sound. City Walk exists because of one mispronounced word. The China program is spelled in an accent before the episode starts. The Chinese mafia arrives with no explanation because none is needed. Wing's voice is funny because of how she says the words. Takayama and Liu Kim cannot understand each other despite both speaking English. That version of the show reached for the easiest available laugh and got it every single time, and the material it produced is the material that outlived the episodes. The voices are what people quote. The satire around them almost never survives the trip out of the television. The second South Park did something harder. It learned real Japanese and put it in the scripts correctly so that half the audience got a different joke than the other half. It rebuilt its own animation from scratch to imitate an art style it admired. It taught a room full of American children the actual history between China and Japan inside a restaurant feud. It aimed an entire episode at a censorship regime and took the consequences. It made an episode about a Japanese product without needing a Japanese character to make fun of. Both of those shows were written by the same two men, usually in the same week, sometimes in the same episode. The defense Parker and Stone have offered for 25 years is that nobody is exempt, that Jesus and Muhammad and Mormons and Scientologists and Jewish characters and black characters and Canadians all get the same treatment, and that pulling one group out for protection would be the actual insult. Taken across the full run of the show, that defense holds up better than most critics allow. The volume really is spread around. There is a version of the equal treatment argument that holds up better than the one usually offered, and the show has earned it. Nobody watching this series believes it protects white Americans. Randy Marsh is the most sustained portrait of an idiot on television. The town's police are corrupt, its teachers are broken, its parents are cowards, and its most beloved character is a 10-year-old fascist. The show has attacked Mormons, Catholics, Scientologists, celebrities, its own network, and its own audience, and it has taken real consequences for some of it, including a permanent security situation after an episode about depicting Muhammad. Against that record, the charge of singling out Asian people does not stand up. What does stand up is a narrower and more awkward point. Every group in that list gets attacked for something they do, believe, or built. The Asian material, more often than any other category, gets its laugh from how people sound and look rather than from anything they did. The problem the defense never solves is the one that shows up in every section of this story. A joke aimed at a town's ignorance still requires somebody to perform the accent, and the accent is what the audience carries home. The satire needs the caricature to function, and the caricature does not need the satire at all. It travels on its own, and it travels further. There is one more thing the run leaves behind, which is a record of how the subject itself changed. In 1999, a Japanese premise on American television meant the war. In 2008, a Chinese premise meant an invasion. By 2019, the Chinese premise was a censorship regime and American cowardice. And by 2023, the Japanese premise was a household appliance that works better than the American one. Nobody wrote an essay about that shift, and nobody at the studio marked it. It happened underneath 24 years of episodes, and the only way to see it is to line the episodes up in order. City Sushi is the only time the show ever addressed that directly, and what it concluded was that the town needed the restaurant open. That ending is more revealing than it probably meant to be. The joke stayed because the joke worked, and the show wrote itself a reason. The joke also outlived its own explanation, which may be the most honest thing to say about it. There are people who can do the City Walk voice on request and have never heard of Dr. Janice, never watched the episode that took the whole thing apart, and would not know what to do with it if they did. The show wrote its own criticism, published it in prime time, and the criticism stayed inside the building while the joke went out the door and kept walking. 26 seasons on, City Walk is still there. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.